Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very, very accomplished professional from Melbourne, Australia, Niti Nadarajah. Niti, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Niti is a coach, a freelance general counsel, and DEI advocate. So, Niti, before we start talking about coaching and DEI, tell me about your own amazing journey from a lawyer to the corporate world, to a coach, to a DEI advocate.
Yeah, so I have been a lawyer for around about 20 years. And I think I always thought I was going to be a lawyer for life because I'd gotten to a point in my career where I'd been doing it for such a long time that it didn't really seem like there were other options, even if I knew what I might want to do if I wasn't doing law. But something happened during the pandemic where it, like with many people, where I sort of started to realize actually potentially there is more I could do. And strangely, that sort of started to happen through engaging on LinkedIn and writing my stories and sharing my views and my thoughts on that platform, which originally wasn't with any particular purpose other than creating some degree of connection in COVID, because obviously it was very isolating. So as I was sharing more and more stories, I started to realize that actually this hole that I'd kind of always felt in my career, or this gap, was starting to fill up, and it was being filled by these conversations that I was having. And so as I had more of these conversations, I started thinking, maybe this can be something, but then, started questioning, well, what could it be? Because I'm just writing and talking and sharing my thoughts. What could I make this? And so I think for the first probably year and a half of COVID, I really was a little bit confused about what the future might hold, but also excited because it did seem to me as if there was something here. And then it was probably in that second year of COVID that I started to think about coaching and whether that might be a possibility. The reason being because I always enjoyed working with people. People management was one of the things that I loved most about the roles that I'd been in. And so it seemed as if coaching might be a natural next step. But it took me a while to convince myself that I should take that step and take that leap of faith and do something a little bit different. And it wasn't until I came across the idea of a portfolio career and potentially doing a number of things at the same time, rather than the traditional working model of you have one job or one business and one focus, and that's all you do, that things started to fall into place for me. And I started thinking, actually, this is a viable opportunity. I could do something where I combine my legal skills and use that as kind of the foundations of the business. So I'm like, well, that's stable. I know what I'm doing. I can pay the mortgage, look after the kids, etc. But also have this buffer then to play an experiment on the side with coaching and DEI consultancy work, which is really kind of my passion area and where I really want to focus more of my energy. And so that's kind of been the journey.
No, fantastic. That's a great response. So let's talk diversity, equity, inclusion first then, and then we'll come to coaching. You live in a very multicultural community, the country.
Yeah.
What, in your opinion, are some of the inequity challenges being faced by women and minority leaders?
Yeah, well, a lot. But in terms of, I guess, a few that come to mind. So I think, firstly, we're still not seeing enough diversity within boards in Australia. And I think this is true across the world. But, in Australia, definitely we're not seeing that diversity. And I think, I remember back to when I started law school, and the dean of our faculty being so proud to be able to say that there were more female entrants or students that year in that first year of law school than there were male, and it was the first time that had ever happened. But then when you look at how that's translated over the 20 years, we're still not seeing that reflected in the senior levels of law firms or of corporates. And I think that problem isn't just unique to the law, it's across industries generally. So I think that's definitely one. I think secondly, people talk a lot about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but it's one thing to talk about it, and it's one thing to put out mission statements about what you want to do when it comes to DEI.
Yeah.
But a lot of the problem comes down to the inclusion aspect and what you're actually doing once you bring these people in the door.
Correct.
And so, how do you change culture? How do you create the environment where these people are actually able to have a voice? Because what you often see is, one person on, say, a board who is a person of color or a person with a disability or a woman or whatever it might be, whatever diversity dimension we're talking about. And because they're only one, even if they're in that senior leadership team, the chances of them being able to have a voice and being able to represent the views of, a community are pretty slim because they're going to be outvoted, outspoken, all the rest of it. And then you add to that some of the cultural nuances, I think, that come with people from certain parts of the world, and where there are cultural differences around things like speaking up, around respect for authority, around all of those things. And you get, again, another layer of challenge in terms of speaking up in societies such as Australia, where, it's very, very much focused on the loudest person wins. So I think there are a few of the challenges I think we're facing in workplaces.
You're so right, Niti. I mean, I've spoken to many women leaders who sit on boards, and I did ask them, I said, you now have a place at the table, but do you have a voice? And a majority of them said not really. But, so I'd love to get your perspective on how does one remove maybe a strong word, but at least start to handle a lot of the biases that exist.
It's really challenging, right? Because unconscious bias is something that we all have.
Correct.
It's not like it's unique to certain people. Everyone within a workplace, everyone within society has biases of some sort. So I think the first thing we can start to do is really unpack what our own biases are, right? This is everyone within an organization. And I'm not talking about unconscious bias training necessarily, but just doing that work to look around you to go, well, who do I associate with? Who are the people that I hang out with? Who am I attracted to? Not in a romantic sense, but who do I hire into a company if I make those sorts of decisions? What do those decisions say about me? What does the team I operate within look like? What are the differences and similarities in that team? And start to really try and understand what your own biases are, and then look at addressing them. Now, that's one layer. And then there's the systemic bias, which, I think requires organizations to really take a hard look at what's happening in their organization at different points, in a person's career. So, if, from really junior roles all the way through to senior roles, what does the gap look like from a pay perspective for gender, for culture, race? Look at different dimensions, right? And compare what the gaps look like. And then start seeing where, there is a divide in terms of the numbers of people that you have who are, say, male versus female, or able-bodied versus disabled, etc. See where those differences lie within the organization.
Correct.
And start to try and understand, well, what's behind this? Because one of the things I think we see quite often, at least here in Australia, and I think it's common across the world, is that things like the gender pay gap tend to worsen around the sort of years where women may go off and have children. Not all women, but many women. And it's then looking at, well, okay, if that's the case and the gender pay gap is increasing, what can we then as an organization do to support these women back into the workplace, and not just support them back into the workplace, but help them to continue to progress through the organization? Because if we don't do that, and when you add to that all the, all societal issues that we have around things like childcare and caregiving stereotypes and things like that, which add to the problem, if we're not supporting these women to continue to progress, then we are going to continue to, exacerbate that problem and that gap.
Well said.
At that point.
The other question that I've often been asked is, in an organization, and I've asked this from many CEOs, where does accountability lie in an organization or a company? And many CEOs have told me on my podcast that accountability is with the CHRO. We have already formulated policy. And I've often wondered why these organizations don't achieve DEI goals. What are your thoughts?
I think that's part of the problem. I think that statement that it lies with a CHRO, or whatever you call the Chief People and Culture Officer, is part of the problem. Because when you place responsibility for diversity, equity, and inclusion in the hands of one person, they're very, it's very unlikely that they're going to be able to deliver on what needs to be done to affect change across the organization. So I think, it needs to become part of the overall mission of the organization. It needs to be something that the leadership team needs to buy into and needs to have accountability for. And then that accountability needs to spread through the organization so that people across the organization are held accountable for, incorporating or bringing more diversity into the organization, or ensuring there's diversity, but also the inclusion piece. So what happens, for example, if someone who's a star performer does something wrong, they discriminate against someone, or they bully someone else, whatever it might be, because of some personal attribute that they have, for example, their sexuality or something. So when that's the case, what happens to that star performer? What wins? Is it the bottom line that wins, or is it, accountability and ensuring that people are actually held to account? Because it's often easy to hold people to account when they're junior within the organization. But when they're senior in the organization and they're also bringing in money, it becomes more challenging, because people start going, well, we don't want to lose this person because they're so good for the business. And that's where the two things start to clash. And I think that's where there needs to be real accountability across the entire organization.
Well said. The other question, one more question on DEI, and then we'll move to coaching. Many countries have legislated. For example, in my country, there is a law which says that 1/3 of all boards have to be women. And yet there seems to be a gap. I wanted to get your perspective on, does legislation help, or is it the answer?
Yeah, I think this goes back to what we were talking about before around cultural change, because you can have quotas or you can have targets, whichever one you want to have, legislated or, at an organizational level as well, which is something we often see. But until you have that cultural shift and that mindset shift and accountability through an organization, it's just going to be a number. And so, yes, it'll go partway there potentially, but it's not going to succeed in changing mindset. So an example of something that I've seen recently is parental leave, and the way we look at this for men, for example. Typically we've had this construct of primary caregivers and secondary caregivers, which is very much, if you're a primary caregiver, you must be the woman, and if you're secondary, you must be the male, right? And now that is starting to change, where organizations and also, governments around the world are starting to look at that a little bit differently and starting to think more about parental leave rather than separating it out between primary and secondary. But it's one thing to have parental leave that's equally available to all genders.
Mm-hmm.
And it's another thing for the organization to actually stand behind that and go, yes, this is a good thing. You know, we need and want fathers to be taking parental leave, because what typically ends up happening is that there'll be people grumbling and going, why does he need to take so much parental leave? You know, can't he take less? Like, really, you know, his wife's at home.
Yeah.
You know, or, you know, she's working part-time. Does he really need to take so much leave? All of those sorts of comments that start being made by leaders are part of the problem. And then, so what we need to try and do then is really, I think, really focus on that change management piece to go, why is this important? Why does this help the bottom line? Why is this good for business, good for people, good for retention of people, all the rest of it? And what does it cost us if we don't do these things, and then go from there?
Amazing. Let's now talk a little bit about your other passion, which is coaching. And you said you started it more recently during the pandemic. As someone who's been a lawyer, who's doing so many diverse things, how has your own background supported your coaching philosophy, your style, and your values?
Yeah, look, I think the one thing that's been really useful from my legal background has been the ability to ask questions, because it's something that, as a lawyer, particularly as an in-house lawyer, more than when I was in private practice, you have to get really good at. You have to know how to ask questions to solicit the right types of information that you need. Now, coaching is obviously a little bit different because you're led by the individual versus wanting to go in a certain direction, which is generally the case when you ask questions from a legal perspective. But I think that ability to ask questions, to listen, to look at the bigger picture, to be able to form those connections between what's going on at a holistic big picture level, and then what's going on in the language that the person is using, in the things that they're saying, and the things that they're not saying, but saying with their body or their face. You know, I think making those connections, I think, is really important. And I think that has been heavily influenced or assisted by my legal background. And I think, to add to that, I think the other piece is around critical thinking, you know, which kind of goes with that connecting the dots, and being able to challenge things, because that's part of what being a lawyer is as well, is going, well, I'm not so sure about that, you know, and I wouldn't necessarily say it that way in a coaching conversation.
Yeah.
But you can say things that prompt a person to think differently about what they've just said, you know. And so I think it's been very useful in my coaching practice.
Fantastic. My next question is on people, you know, and all of us are influenced by people. And I wanted to ask you, how have some of the people who have influenced you influenced your work as a coach?
Good question. So I think there are a number of aspects to this. I think, firstly, if I think back to what has led me down this path and to coaching and diversity, equity, and inclusion, interestingly enough, I think there is an influence there from my dad. And the influence is that for many, many, many years, and when we were younger, my dad would always focus on, you know, doing the right thing by people, and the fact that it was important to be fair and just and all the rest of it. And I think that's very much influenced the way I look at the world and the way, you know, my worldview is formed, essentially.
Correct.
So I think that's definitely led me down the path towards diversity and inclusion work. From a coaching perspective, having been on the LinkedIn platform for a few years now and having connected with some amazing people during my, you know, 2 to 3 years of being quite active on it, I have met some incredibly talented and amazing people through that, including, you know, having worked with my own coach when I was looking at starting my own thing. And so I think it's all those people along the way that you meet and that you get to learn from, you get to grow with, you get to support. that have really influenced me and my coaching style. And I think the other thing that I absolutely have to mention is that I've also been doing a lot of NLP, neuro-linguistic programming training. And so I'm a NLP practitioner and doing my master prac at the moment. And so the woman who's been leading that, Amy Bell, has been very much influential in the way that I now coach, because a lot of those techniques and methods are things that I now bring to my coaching as well.
Very interesting. So, Niti, I have time for two more questions. My next question is about the young leaders. I'm from the boomers generation, but when I talk to young leaders like the millennials and Gen Zs, they brought a breath of fresh air into most organizations, very different perspectives, very different paradigms. As a coach, what, in your opinion, are some of the areas these young leaders need to be coached in?
Look, I think anyone and everyone can and should benefit from coaching, because I think, the more people you can have to reflect back to you what you're saying, thinking, believing, and perhaps create a shift in those thoughts, beliefs, etc., the better. I think, though, one of the things that I believe is really important, and, I'm a mum, I've got 2 kids, and so it's something I try and do with my oldest, who's 9, nearly 9, is really this concept of, who are you and what do you believe in, and who do you want to be versus what do you want to do in life, which was very much what we grew up with, or I grew up with for sure. And I think for me, it's that concept with millennials now, the way that we work and the way that people change careers and do different things is changing and has changed dramatically over the last probably decade. And it's going to continue to change. But I think it's some of those things, like just ensuring that that they keep themselves open to opportunities and continue to invest in their own growth and learning. And I think what we're seeing now with the shift in the way we're working, I think probably means that, millennials and the younger generations will probably take advantage of things like coaching earlier than many of us did. Like, the first time I was ever coached was last year. So, I'm hoping that actually this is something that's a positive move, and it's going to really create some momentum when it comes to people actually doing something to create shifts within themselves.
Well said. And my last question to you, Niti, and this is for the many, many people who will listen to our conversation. Based on your own incredible journey, and all the different things that you've done, what would you say are 3 lessons you would want our viewers and listeners to take away from your own journey and from our conversation?
Yeah, I think the first one is to do the work to understand what your values are. I think we often talk about values, but when we're asked what they are, it's very hard to articulate what they are if we haven't done the work to actually identify them. And I think the reason it's so important is because once you understand what your values are, you can more easily prioritize in your life. You can live in alignment with what's important to you, and you can create boundaries as well, which is something I think that we all need more of nowadays, particularly with the blurring of work and home. The second thing I would say is around self-care. I think, I've definitely over the years, worked in a way that was not healthy and that did damage from a health perspective. And I think for me, this has been one of the things that I look back on, and there aren't many of these sorts of things, but this is one that I do look back on and go, I wish I'd done things a little bit differently, and I wish I'd looked after me better at that point in time. And I think for particularly the younger generations, that's something I'd really encourage that they do, right? Number 3, let me think of a number 3. I think number 3 would be keeping yourself open to opportunity.
Mm.
For a long time, I think I was really blinkered to opportunities and what might be out there.
Yeah.
And I sort of assumed that because I'd been doing the same thing for a long time, I had to keep doing the same thing for much longer. And it was only when I started to explore different parts of myself and bring those to the table more that I started to remove those blinkers. And the amazing thing is that once you remove those blinkers, opportunities come your way that you can't even dream of. There's no way, if someone had talked to me 5 years ago about all the things I'm doing now and all that's happened in the last year or last few years, that I would have believed them.
Yeah. Because
it wasn't in my line of vision. And so I think that's pretty important. Don't remain so rigid with the path that you're on.
Well said. And on that note, Niti, and your 3 amazing lessons, do the work to understand your values. Self-care is absolutely critical, and keep yourself open to opportunity. Thank you so much for speaking to me about your own journey. Thank you for talking to me about a lot of your thoughts on the diversity, equity, and inclusion piece, and how there are so many different aspects that have to be taken in the right context, in the right organizations. Thank you also for speaking to me about your journey as a coach. Thank you again, and good luck to you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.